Imagine you have carved a life for yourself out of sheer will, a solitary existence nestled deep in the unforgiving timberlands of the Montana Territory. Your only conversations are with your horse and the echo of your own thoughts. You return after a week on the hunt, anticipating the familiar silence of your cabin, the cold hearth waiting for a flame. But as you clear the final rise, a thin, unfamiliar curl of smoke is rising from your chimney. It's a violation, a question mark hanging in the still summer air, and in the year 1872, an unexpected question mark is often just another word for a bullet. Marcus Thorne felt that question in his gut. He reined in his horse, a sturdy buckskin named Grit, and listened. The only sounds were the buzz of horseflies and the gentle creak of leather. The deer slung across Grit's back was a heavy, satisfying weight, the successful end to a long stalk. But the satisfaction had evaporated, replaced by a cold, familiar watchfulness that had been honed on the battlefields of the South a decade prior. He'd come to these mountains to escape men, to forget the crack of rifles and the smell of blood. Yet the smoke from his own chimney suggested men had found him anyway. He slid his Winchester from its scabbard, the metal warm from the sun, and dismounted, moving with a predator's silence through the pines that guarded his home. The cabin was small, built by his own two hands with notched logs and stubborn resolve. It was his fortress against the world. And someone was inside. He reached the door, which stood slightly ajar. The smell that drifted out was not the simple, savory scent of the rabbit stew he usually made. It was more complex, laced with the sharp aroma of wild ginger and something else, something green and fragrant he couldn't name. He pushed the door open with the barrel of his rifle. A sight that met his eyes stopped him cold. It was not a claim jumper, nor a band of outlaws. By the hearth, stirring a pot that hung over his fire, was a woman. She was slender, almost frail, and her hair was the color of polished jet, tied back in a way he'd never seen. But it was her dress that held his gaze. It was a ruin of what it once must have been, a garment of shimmering, silvery gray silk that clung to her form, its high collar and intricate fastenings speaking of a world 1,000 miles and 1,000 years from this rough-hewn cabin. It was torn and stained with dirt and what looked like dried blood, yet it still held a ghost of impossible elegance. When she heard him, she didn't scream. She froze, her back to him, the wooden spoon in her hand held like a scepter. Slowly she turned. Her face was smudged with soot, her cheekbones sharp from hunger, but her eyes were vast and dark, and in their depths a terror warred with a fierce, unbreakable pride. Marcus kept the Winchester level, his thumb resting on the hammer. His voice was a low rumble, rusty from disuse. "You've got 10 seconds to tell me who you are and what you're doing in my home." The woman's eyes darted from his face to the rifle and back again. Her lips parted, but only a shaky breath came out. She took a small step back, her hand still clutching the spoon as if it were her only shield against the harsh reality of the man who had just appeared in the doorway, a giant of a man framed by the bright summer sun, smelling of pine and gunpowder and death. He saw the tremor in her hands, the exhaustion etched so deeply around her eyes that it seemed carved into the bone. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of soldiers who had marched too far and seen too much. Still, this was his home, his sanctuary, and she was an intruder. "I ain't gonna ask again," he growled, the words feeling foreign and harsh in the quiet space. Finally she found her voice. It was soft, melodic, but frayed at the edges with fear. "Please," she whispered, her English heavily accented but clear. "I mean, no harm. I was cold. Hungry." She gestured with the spoon toward the bubbling pot, an offering of peace. The aroma was maddening, a siren's call to his own empty stomach. He saw she'd used some of the dried vegetables he kept in a sack, but had added wild greens and roots he hadn't known were edible. She had not just taken, she had created. The detail was small, but it shifted something in his resolve. He lowered the rifle an inch. "That don't answer my first question. Who are you?" She swallowed hard, her gaze unwavering. "My name is Leanne." His stare was hard, unyielding. He had built this life of solitude precisely to avoid complications like the one currently stirring his stew pot. Complications had a way of bringing noise and trouble and men with guns. He had his fill of all three. "Leanne," he repeated, testing the name on his tongue. It sounded like a bird's call, something delicate and out of place among the hard consonants of his world. He stepped fully inside, letting the heavy door swing shut behind him, plunging the cabin into the dim, fire-lit gloom. He leaned the Winchester against the wall by the door, but kept his Colt revolver holstered on his hip, a silent reminder of the balance of power. He motioned with his head toward the small wooden stool he used. "Sit." Leanne obeyed instantly, her movements fluid and graceful despite her exhaustion. She sat with a straight back, her hands folded in her lap, a posture of quiet dignity that seemed absurd given her tattered state. Marcus ladled some of the stew into a wooden bowl and pushed it across the rough plank table toward her. Her eyes widened, but she didn't move. "Eat," he commanded, his voice less harsh this time. He watched as she picked up the spoon with hands that trembled slightly and took the first sip. She closed her eyes for a moment. He saw the profound relief of a starving creature finally granted sustenance. He served himself a bowl and sat opposite her. The stew was better than anything he had ever cooked. The wild ginger cut through the richness of the rabbit he now assumed she'd found in one of his snares close to the cabin. While they ate in silence, he studied her. She was young, perhaps not yet 20. Her skin, where it wasn't bruised or smudged, was like porcelain, but it was the mark on her left wrist that drew his attention. As her sleeve shifted, he saw it. A brand. An ugly, puckered scar in the shape of a stylized S. It was the mark of property, a symbol he'd seen on cattle, but never on a person. Suddenly, her story began to take on a darker, more dangerous shape. This was no simple traveler lost in the woods. This was a runaway. And the kind of man who brands a person was the kind of man who would not stop looking for his property. When they finished, he took the bowls. "The mines," he said. It wasn't a question. Her head snapped up, fear flashing in her eyes again. She nodded, a single sharp movement. "Sterling Consolidated," he continued, his voice flat. He'd heard of the outfit. They operated a silver mine over the next ridge, notorious for their use of indentured Chinese laborers. Men and women worked to death in the dark, their contracts bought and sold like cattle futures. "You run from them." Again she nodded, pulling her sleeve down over the brand as if she could hide the truth of it. They will look for me," she whispered. "I know," Marcus said, and the two words fell between them with the weight of an anvil. His peaceful, solitary world was already gone. It had vanished the moment he saw the smoke from his chimney. He felt a familiar, unwelcome churn in his gut. It was the feeling he got before a fight, the cold certainty that a line was about to be crossed. He could tell her to leave. He could point her toward the nearest town, a good 50 miles away, and wash his hands of it. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. Sterling was a name that carried weight in this territory, backed by money and men who shot first and never asked questions at all. Harboring his property was a death sentence. Marcus looked at Leanne. She was watching him, her dark eyes searching his face, trying to read the verdict he was about to pass. She wasn't pleading. She was simply waiting, braced for the blow. And in that moment, he saw not a fragile girl, but a survivor. He saw the steel that had carried her through an escape, through the wilderness, and into his cabin. He thought of the promises he'd made to himself when he came to these mountains, promises of peace and quiet. But he also thought of another promise, an older one, made in the din of cannon fire to a friend who had died in his arms, a promise to never again stand by and watch the strong crush the weak. He let out a long, slow breath, the sound of his own surrender. "There's a storm coming in from the west," he said, changing the subject. "You can stay till it passes. There's a pallet by the fire." Leanne's shoulders sagged with a relief so profound it was almost painful to watch. "Thank you," she breathed, the words thick with emotion. He just grunted in response, turning away so she wouldn't see the conflict in his eyes. As he was banking the fire for the night, he noticed a small object on the mantelpiece, something that hadn't been there before. It was a hairpin, carved from pale green jade into the shape of a crane. It was a piece of exquisite craftsmanship, something that had no place in this world of iron and wood. It spoke of a past, a life before the brand, and he knew with a sinking certainty that the trouble coming for them was even greater than he had imagined. The one night bled into 3, then a week. The promised storm had come and gone, a brief, violent squall that washed the summer dust from the pines. But Leanne remained. Neither of them spoke of her leaving. An unspoken routine settled over the cabin, a quiet rhythm of shared existence. Marcus would rise before dawn to hunt or check his trap lines, and when he returned, the cabin would be clean, a pot of something savory simmering over the fire, and a strange sense of peace would greet him at the door. Leanne was a silent, efficient presence. She mended the tears in his buckskin shirt with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She found a patch of wild mint and brewed a tea that soothed the perpetual ache in his shoulder, a souvenir from a piece of shrapnel at Antietam. She never spoke of her past, and he never asked. The silence between them was a landscape of its own, vast and filled with unspoken questions. He found himself watching her. He watched the way her slender fingers could gut a fish with a surgeon's precision, the way she would hum a soft, unfamiliar melody while she worked. He saw the terror that still lived behind her eyes, the way she would flinch if he moved too quickly or raised his voice. At night, he would lie on his bunk and listen to her troubled sleep, her soft cries lost in the crackle of the dying fire. He started leaving his Colt on the table instead of his hip when he was inside, a small, unconscious gesture of trust. One afternoon, he returned with a deep gash on his forearm, the result of a slip on a mossy rock while hauling a beaver trap from the creek. He'd intended to just splash some whiskey on it and ignore it, but Leanne saw it the moment he walked in. Before he could protest, she was there, her expression serious. She gently took his arm, her touch surprisingly firm. He was a big man and she was small, but there was no hesitation in her. He found himself sitting at the table, oddly docile, as she cleaned the wound with water she'd boiled with herbs. Her touch was light, professional, yet it sent a jolt through him, a warmth that had nothing to do with the sting of the antiseptic herbs. She tore a strip from the hem of her own ruined silk dress, the gray fabric a stark contrast to his weathered skin, and bound the wound with a practiced efficiency. As she tied the knot, her fingers brushed against his, and for a heartbeat their eyes met. In that moment, he saw something other than fear in her gaze. He saw gratitude and a quiet strength that mirrored his own. He felt a crack form in the thick wall he had built around his heart, a wall that had stood for 10 long years. He cleared his throat and pulled his arm back, unnerved by the intensity of the feeling. "It'll do," he mumbled, not meeting her eyes. But the feeling lingered, the ghost of her touch on his skin. Later that week he rode the perimeter of his territory, a wide 10-mile loop. He found what he had been dreading. Tracks. 3 horses, shod, heading in the direction of the pass. They were searching, moving in a grid pattern. They were professionals. The quiet days were over. The debt for his small moments of peace was coming due. He knew he should be afraid, or at least angry that this trouble had landed on his doorstep. But as he looked back toward the thin plume of smoke rising from his cabin, the only thing he felt was a cold, hard resolve. What he did not yet know was that they were not just searching. They were closing a net, and his cabin was right in the center of it. That evening, the air in the cabin was thick with a tension that had not been there before. Marcus cleaned his Winchester with slow, deliberate movements, the familiar scent of gun oil filling the small space. Leanne watched him, her hands still, her usual evening tasks forgotten. She knew. She could read the grim set of his jaw, the hard look in his slate-gray eyes. "They are close," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Marcus didn't look up from his work. Found tracks 3 miles east of the creek. 3 riders. He slid the bolt back into place with a satisfying click. "They're casting a wide net, but they're being thorough. They'll be here. Maybe tomorrow, maybe the day after." He finally looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You need to tell me everything. Not just about the mine. Everything. No more secrets. A man's got a right to know what he's dying for." The bluntness of his words hung in the air. Leanne flinched, but she did not look away. She took a deep breath, the kind a person takes before diving into deep, cold water. "Sterling is not just a mine boss," she began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "In San Francisco, he is a man of great importance. He deals in more than silver. He deals in people." She told him of her father, a merchant and minor official from Guangzhou, who had come to America with dreams of trade and partnership. He had trusted the wrong man, a business associate who introduced him to Sterling. There was a deal, a shipment of silk and tea, a betrayal. Her father was ruined, accused of debts he did not owe. To settle this false debt, Sterling had taken the only thing of value her father had left, his daughter. "He did not send me to the mines to work," Leanne said, her voice laced with a venomous disgust. "Not at first. He kept me in his house, a prize, a curiosity for his friends to look at." She held up the jade hairpin. "This was a gift from my grandmother. It is all I have left of my family. He wanted it. I would not give it to him." The story tumbled out, a tale of gilded cages and quiet cruelties. Sterling was not just a brute. He was a collector of beautiful things, and he considered her the most beautiful piece in his collection. When she had defied him one too many times, he had sent her to the mines as punishment, to break her spirit, certain she would beg to return to the comfort of his home. He had underestimated her. He had not counted on her will to be free. "He does not want a worker back," she finished, her eyes burning with a cold fire. "He wants his property. He wants to prove that nothing can be taken from him." Now Marcus understood. This was not about a lost investment for Sterling. It was about pride. It was about a deep, possessive vanity that would not countenance being defied, especially by a woman he considered a lesser being. A man like that would not give up. He would burn the whole mountain to the ground to reclaim what he believed was his. Marcus stood up and walked to the cabin's single window, peering out into the deepening twilight. The peaceful woods he had called home now seemed to hold 1,000 shadows, each one a potential threat. He had a choice. He could still send her away, try to buy his own safety. But as he looked at her reflection in the dark glass, at her small, determined face, he knew it was no longer a choice. He had made it the moment he let her stay. He turned back to her, his face set like granite. Then we'll be ready for him. The next day was spent in preparation for a war. The quiet domestic rhythm of the cabin was replaced by the grim mechanics of defense. Marcus showed Leanne how to load and fire the spare Remington revolver he kept. He expected her to be timid, to shy away from the weapon's weight and violent purpose. Instead, she took it with a steady hand, her brow furrowed in concentration as she listened to his instructions. Her fingers, which he had only seen perform delicate tasks like sewing and cooking, proved nimble and sure as she thumbed cartridges into the cylinder. "Aim for the center of the body," he told her, his voice devoid of emotion. "Don't try for a headshot. Just point and pull the trigger until it's empty." She nodded, her dark eyes fixed on his, absorbing every word. There was no fear in them now, only a chilling resolve. They barricaded the single window with a heavy table, leaving just enough of a gap to shoot through. He mapped out an escape route for her, a path through the dense thicket behind the cabin that led to a small, hidden cave in the rock face. "If they breach the door, you run," he commanded. "Don't look back. Head north. Follow the creek until you hit the main river. Keep going." He was giving her a chance to survive him, and they both knew it. That evening, as the sun bled across the western peaks, a strange calm settled over them. The work was done. All that was left was the waiting. They sat by the fire, the revolver lying on the crate between them. The silence was different now, not of caution, but of shared fate. "The scar," Leanne said softly, pointing to the long, faded line that ran from his temple to his jaw. "How did you get it?" He had not spoken of it to anyone in over a decade, but looking at her, he found the words. He told her about a place called Sharpsburg, about the deafening roar of cannons, and a young man from Ohio who had fought beside him. He told her how they had sworn to each other that if they survived, they would find a place so quiet they could forget the sound of war forever. The other man hadn't made it. Marcus had carried his memory here, to this mountain, seeking the peace they had both dreamed of. "Looks like I failed at that," he finished, a bitter smile twisting his lips. Leanne reached out, her fingers tracing the path of the old wound, with a touch as light as a moth's wing. It was not a gesture of pity, but of understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the scars they both carried, one on the outside, one on the inside. "You did not fail," she whispered. "You gave him peace here. Now, you fight for it." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a refugee or a victim, but an equal, a partner. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a sheathed knife, its handle worn smooth from use. It was his spare, a perfectly balanced blade. He offered it to her, handle first. "For you," he said, "not for cooking." She took it, her gaze locking with his. It was a promise, a vow. They were in this together, until the end. The morning arrived hot and unnaturally still. The usual chatter of squirrels and jays was absent. The forest was holding its breath. Grit, his horse, was restless in the small corral, stamping a hoof and snorting at the silent trees. Marcus stood just inside the cabin door, watching the ridgeline. He saw them just after noon. 3 figures on horseback, black silhouettes against the brilliant blue sky. They moved slowly, deliberately, their confidence an insult to the sanctity of his home. One rider was different. Even from a distance, Marcus could see he was dressed in a fine black coat and hat, absurdly out of place in the rugged wilderness. Sterling. The other 2 were rougher shapes, hired guns who sat their saddles with a deadly slouch. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, 100 yards out. Sterling dismounted and walked forward alone, his hands held out to his sides in a gesture of false peace. His voice, when it came, was smooth and cultured, carrying easily in the still air. "Thorne, I know you're in there. My name is Sterling. I believe you have something that belongs to me." Marcus stepped out onto the porch, the Winchester held loosely in his right hand, its barrel pointed at the ground. He stood there, a silent, immovable object. "I'm a reasonable man," Sterling continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "The girl is surely a charming creature, but she's caused me a great deal of trouble. I'm willing to compensate you for your hospitality. Name a price. $200? Marcus's face remained a stony mask. He thought of the brand on Leanne's wrist, the terror in her eyes. "She ain't for sale," he said, his voice a low growl that was more dangerous than any shout. Sterling's smile tightened. "I see. You wish to be a hero. A foolish choice. I will have my property back. The easy way, or a much, much harder way? It is of no consequence to me." Marcus raised the Winchester until it was level with his hip. "Turn your horses around and ride out," he said, his voice cold and final. "This is your only warning." For a moment Sterling just stared. Then he laughed, a short, ugly sound. He turned and gave a sharp nod to his men. The quiet of the mountains shattered into 1,000 pieces as the world exploded in gunfire. Marcus was already diving back through the doorway as bullets ripped through the air, splintering the log frame. The serene cabin was instantly transformed into a death trap, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and shattered pine. He scrambled to the barricaded window, returning fire with the Winchester, the rifle's powerful report a deafening roar in the enclosed space. He saw one of the gunmen clutch his arm and curse, but both quickly took cover behind a rocky outcrop. The siege had begun. They were professionals, content to pin him down, to turn his home into his coffin. Behind him, Leanne was not cowering. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, but she moved with a purpose that amazed him. As he fired his last shot, she was there, pressing the loaded Remington into his hand, her movements economical and swift. She was a part of this fight, a vital cog in their desperate machine of survival. They exchanged no words, only the weapons, their hands brushing in the frantic, rhythmic dance of combat. A bullet punched through the wall just above her head, showering her with wood fragments. She didn't even flinch. But then, a moment of chaos. A volley of shots peppered the front of the cabin, and one found a weaker spot in the log wall. Marcus heard a sharp cry of pain. He whirled around. Leanne was on one knee, her hand pressed to her shoulder, a dark stain spreading rapidly across the gray silk of her dress. A rage, cold and absolute, seized him. It was a fury he had not felt since the war, a primal, protective instinct that burned away all fear, all strategy, leaving only the need to destroy the men who had hurt her. "Stay down," he snarled, and before she could protest, he was moving. He knew this land, every rock and ravine. They did not. He burst out the back door, staying low, and used the dense cover of the woods to circle around their position. He moved like a ghost, his footfalls silent on the pine needles. He spotted the first gunman, the one he'd winged, reloading behind a large boulder. Marcus raised the Winchester, took a breath, and fired. The man collapsed without a sound. One down. He crept forward, his focus narrowed to a single point. The last gunman who was still laying down suppressing fire on the cabin. He had to end this, now. He was so focused on his target that he failed to see the subtle shift in the shadows to his left, a mistake he would have paid for with his life. The gunman he thought he'd surprised had a partner, but before the man could bring his pistol to bear, a shot rang out, sharp and distinct from the heavier boom of the rifles. It came from the cabin. The gunman grunted, startled, clutching at a wound in his leg as he stumbled. The shot had been wild, but it had bought Marcus the 1 second he needed. He didn't hesitate. His own shot was true. The sudden, ringing silence was more shocking than the noise. Marcus stood for a moment, his chest heaving, the smell of cordite sharp in his nostrils. He saw Sterling, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, scrambling for his horse. The man was no fighter. He was a coward who paid others to do his dirty work. Sterling made a desperate run for it, but his fine leather shoes were not made for this terrain. He blundered through the trees, blind with panic, heading straight for the shale slide near the eastern ravine, a place Marcus knew to be treacherous. He heard a terrified shout, the rattle of loose rock, and then a final, choked-off scream that echoed once, before being swallowed by the vast emptiness of the mountains. Marcus didn't even go to look. The wilderness had passed its own judgment. It was a more fitting end than a bullet from his gun could ever provide. He turned and ran back to the cabin. Leanne was standing on the porch, the heavy Remington held in both hands, her arms shaking from the effort. The gun slipped from her grasp and clattered onto the wooden planks. Her face was ashen from pain and shock. He reached her in 3 long strides. He didn't speak. There were no words for what had just passed between them. He simply gathered her into his arms, mindful of her wounded shoulder, and held her. For the first time since she had arrived, she let go, her body shaking with silent, racking sobs against his chest. He gently led her inside, away from the carnage, and began to tend to her wound. Summer mellowed into a long, golden autumn. The bullet holes in the cabin walls were plugged with fresh clay, the splintered door frame replaced. Life settled back into a rhythm, but it was a new one, a harmony played by 2 instruments instead of 1. Leanne's shoulder healed, leaving a thin white scar that mirrored the one on his own face. They were a match set now, marked by the same fire. The brand on her wrist faded, a ghostly reminder of a life that felt a world away. She never spoke of Sterling or the mines again, and he never asked. The ghosts had been exorcised by gunpowder and blood. He taught her how to track, how to read the signs of the forest, how to shoot the Winchester with a steady hand and a clear eye. She, in turn, brought a softness to his hard-edged world. She planted a small garden of herbs and hardy vegetables that flourished under her care. She taught him the names of the constellations as they appeared in the ink-black sky, telling him the ancient stories that went with them, her voice a soft melody against the chirping of the crickets. The silence between them was no longer a space to be cautiously navigated. It was a comfortable, shared quiet, rich with unspoken understanding. He found himself smiling, a rustiness in his features unaccustomed to the expression. He had come to this mountain seeking solitude, a place to be alone with his ghosts. He had not realized he was just lonely. Leanne had come to his cabin seeking a temporary shelter, a place to hide. She had found a home. One evening they stood on the small porch, watching the last rays of sunlight set the distant peaks ablaze with color. Grit, his horse, nickered softly from the corral. The air was crisp, carrying the promise of the coming winter. Marcus turned to her, the question rising in him unbidden. "Are you happy, Leanne?" She looked away from the sunset to meet his gaze. Her dark eyes were clear now, the shadows of fear long since banished. She looked at the sturdy cabin, the thriving garden, the vast protective sweep of the mountains around them. Then her eyes came back to his face, and she smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "I am home," she said. The 2 simple words held everything: her past, their shared battle, their peaceful present, and the unspoken promise of a future together. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. He had returned to his cabin that day to find a stranger at his hearth, and in doing so had found the missing part of his own soul. The gunslinger had finally, truly come home. Their story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most profound changes in our lives arrive unexpectedly, like a curl of smoke from a chimney that shouldn't be lit. It shows that home is not merely a place of shelter, but a sanctuary we build with and for another person, defended by courage and cemented by love. If you were moved by Marcus and Leanne's journey, please give this video a like and share it with someone who appreciates a story of survival and unlikely connection. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you won't miss our next tale from the untamed frontier. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What do you believe was the single moment that Marcus truly knew he would risk everything for Leanne? Was it seeing the brand the first time she tended his wound, or the moment he saw her holding the revolver? Let us know below.